Ms Wilson.
My lady, the first witness today is Miss Sarah Elliott.
If you could repeat after me, please. I do solemnly.
I do solemnly.
Sincerely and truly.
Sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please. Thanks.
Thank you for coming to join us on a wet Monday morning.
You are Sarah Elliott, is that right?
Yeah.
You've provided 2 witness statements to this module, one with reference number INQ 000656193, dated the 26th of September 2025, and another with reference number INQ 000659803, dated the 21st of November 2025. Are both of those true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
That's true, yes.
Thank you. And you're giving evidence today, Miss Elliott, in your capacity as the former Chief Executive Officer of the National Council of Voluntary Organisations. Is that right?
That's correct.
A role you left recently but held for the majority of the pandemic.
That's correct.
And a bit of background on the NCVO. It's the membership community for charities, voluntary organisations and community groups in England. Is that right?
That's right.
Over 17,000 members, the majority of whom are small or micro organisations.
That's right.
And the NCVO's role and responsibilities include working with government to ensure charities have the conditions they need to achieve their mission and roles, but also to ensure government understands the significant social and economic role of charities.
That's correct.
Can I start with a brief overview of the charity sector? It's very diverse, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very diverse sector, and indeed NCVO's membership reflects the diversity of the sector. So the majority of the sector are very small, often volunteer-led, often community groups, and the more sort of household name charities that be more familiar to the public represent a minority of the sector, but receive a larger proportion of the sector's income.
And you say in your statement that the smaller and more specialist organisations were especially vulnerable to economic shocks. Why was that?
In part, it was because ahead of the pandemic, they had been underinvested in for many years for lots of complex reasons. They often lack the capacity to access grants from trusts and foundations, or indeed to access government funding.
Thank you. The role of charities in response to the pandemic was significant, wasn't it? I think you say in the statement they were at the heart of the nation's response. Is that right?
That's correct. Charities at the start of the pandemic did what charities do best. They stepped up to support communities to respond to the crisis.
And you describe a core element of the NCVO's work was to assess the ongoing financial health of the sector and the impact on charities during the pandemic. Can you just provide an overview of what the pressure points experienced by your members were?
Yes. So charities really faced a perfect storm of declining income and indeed declining resources more broadly in terms of volunteers at a time of increased costs and increased need in communities. So just to go into a bit more detail on those elements, in terms of income, donations and fundraising were very severely affected upon lockdown. So, for example, events were cancelled. It's well documented, the amount of money that was lost just by the London Marathon being cancelled, but also all of those smaller community events. And also in less obvious ways. So, for example, door-to-door fundraising couldn't happen anymore, and that's a really important pipeline for charities in securing those regular givers, those direct debits. Investment income was also severely affected, and another pressure point was public services. So charities deliver public services using public money, and for many years ahead of the pandemic, those contracts were often underfunded, not keeping up with inflation. So charities were subsidising those, but less able to do so with that fundraised income cut off. In terms of the increased costs, this included having to switch to remote delivery, so investing investing in digital costs, and also for those who did keep delivering face-to-face, investing in personal protective equipment. And then in terms of rising need in communities, some of this was about the immediate pandemic response, but some of this might have been the well-documented need for increased support for domestic violence, loneliness and isolation, charities providing mental health support, just to give a few examples.
Thank you. And you've described a moment ago that many of your members really stepped up and were able to continue operating during the pandemic. The inquiry's listening exercise, Every Story Matters, heard similar accounts of that, but also, for example, from a leader of a charity in England who described, as a not-for-profit company, we don't have a lot of financial reserves. We live fairly hand-to-mouth. We're 100% self-funded. We weren't relying on funding from anywhere. We earned the money that we spent, and obviously, when you lose the ability to earn that money, it puts everything that you're doing on hold. So it stopped our operations straight away. Is that reflective of some of your members' experience, that the perfect storm you've described meant they couldn't continue?
It is, yes. I mean, as I said slightly earlier, the nature of the sector is hugely diverse, and each charity will have a different makeup of income streams. Some charities will hold more reserves than others. We know a proportion of the sector came into the pandemic with no reserves. So the statement you just read out is reflective of a proportion of the sector that had no reserves to fall back on, and with income cut off, would have to stop all expenditure and operations as a result.
You explain in your statement that charities required targeted financial support during the pandemic. Can you elaborate on why you say that was?
Well, there were two main reasons. One was that, unlike businesses, charities were having to step up. They couldn't mothball like a pub or a cinema could. Many charities were most needed during the pandemic and needed to step up to meet that increased need, and so actually required additional resources and additional funding to be able to do that. But even for those charities that were not essential to the immediate pandemic response, we now know they are essential to the recovery from the pandemic and to wider society and the economy. And so they needed to be able to stabilise because of those very severe and immediate economic shocks that they experienced when lockdown commenced. Of course.
Did the operating or economic model of some charities mean that they in particular needed targeted support?
Every charity was different, and every charity had a different makeup of income streams. Some of those were more impacted than others. We know, for example, that trusts and foundations really stepped up during the pandemic, even though their own investments were impacted, and they tried to continue to not only honour their existing grantees, but also where they could provide additional support. Whereas other charities, perhaps those who were more reliant on face-to-face fundraising, may have lost all their income overnight. So it was a very diverse picture.
I want to ask you now about cooperation and joint working with the government on the economic response. How did the NCVO go about working jointly with the government, and particularly which parts of it?
So the NCVO had long-standing existing relationships with DCMS in particular, and what was then the Office for... now it's the Office for Civil Society, then it was... I had a different name, sorry, I forget. And we also had recently established relationships with officials in Number 10, in the relatively new government in Number 10. And when the pandemic started, we drew on those existing relationships, and our communications, both in terms of meetings and emails and letters, were more frequent, sometimes twice daily meetings with officials in DCMS, from my recollection. One of the biggest challenges we faced was we didn't have relationships across government in the way that we needed, given the cross-governmental nature of the support that the sector requires, both in peacetime but also also in a crisis. In particular, we had no relationship with the Treasury, which is where all of the major decisions were being taken in terms of providing economic support to the different sectors of the economy.
So did you rely on the Office of Civil Society to pass on that information that you'd passed to them, to people like the Treasury or the other relevant departments?
We did, yes. That was our main way of communicating with the Treasury via the Office of Civil Society.
And did you think that message was passed on effectively?
Well, what we have to go on is what came out in terms of those support schemes. And as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss, they were often not designed with charities in mind and therefore difficult to access. And even the specific support scheme for charities was quite late in being announced and probably not as substantial as it needed to be to respond to the need in communities that the sector was supporting. We know officials in DCMS were working at pace and under immense pressure. And as I say, we had daily communication with them, but we often got the message back via them from the Treasury that they needed more data, more information, and they seemingly weren't convinced by the case that we were making.
Thank you. You also say in your statement that you felt there was an undue focus of government on charity closures in order to make the case for support. Why did the NCVO consider this wasn't an effective measure of the impact on the sector?
Well, what we took from this was, again, a lack of understanding about the nature of the voluntary sector. Charities are founded by people that want to make a difference in the world, and by our very nature, when there's a crisis, we will step up and we will help as much as we can. And so many charities that faced a shortfall in income made really difficult decisions about long-term financial sustainability or immediate need. So many drew on their reserves, which are there for a rainy day and for when there is a crisis. And even those that didn't have reserves perhaps just chose to reduce or even cease all of their operations, perhaps go into almost hibernation for a time rather than choose to close. And we know from the data from that 2020-2021 year that we didn't see a significantly higher number of closures than normal. And so we didn't feel that closures would happen quickly, if indeed they did happen at all. And we thought there'd be a delayed effect and charities would do all they can to keep going for as long as they can.
I want to ask you now about the economic schemes which were available to your members. I'm going to start by looking at the sector-specific support, but we'll come back to the pan-economy measures afterwards. So the main package available, as I understand it, to your members was the £750 million financial package to the voluntary community and social enterprise sector. Is that right?
That's correct.
This was announced by the Chancellor on the 8th of April 2020. Was that announcement and that support soon enough for your members?
It was not soon enough. Many charity leaders in those first few weeks of lockdown were facing impossible decisions. It takes time to reduce the size of an organisation in terms of making staff redundant, and charity leaders were calling me on an almost daily basis asking when support was coming, was support going to be announced, because they and their boards were facing impossible decisions, as I've already outlined, about whether they draw on their reserves and put at risk the long-term sustainability of the organisation or reduce quickly. So it was not quick enough, in my opinion.
As part of his announcement, the Chancellor said that he couldn't stand there and save every single job, protect every single business, or indeed every single charity. And in your statement, you say the NCVO viewed the comparison between business and charities as misinterpreting the contribution charities make. Why do you say that?
Because at the same time as we were hearing that statement from the Chancellor, we were also being asked to step up and support the response to the crisis, which made us very different from businesses that could mothball for a time. So just to give one example, we were asked for lists of charities in local community areas which could contribute to the pandemic response. We were supporting with the mass mobilisation of volunteers. And so we felt the comparison just misunderstood the nature of charities which were not profit and loss businesses, but absolutely kind of vital to the health of communities.
Your organisation did welcome the support package being announced at that time, as I understand it, but you identified some concerns with it. Could you outline what those were, please?
Yeah, so in the run-up to the £750 million being announced, we said the scheme needed to be three things. It needed to be substantial, swift and simple. And in my view, it fell short on all of those counts. In terms of SWIFT, as I've already outlined, we thought it took too long. Even in peacetime, it would have been an extremely fast announcement of funding.
Could I just ask you to slow your answers down a little,
yes.
So the stenographer can keep
In
it?
peacetime, it would have been a very quick piece of work, but given the crisis, given the impossible decisions charity leaders were making about their organisations, it wasn't fast enough. In terms of substantial, at the time we welcomed the support, we didn't want to appear ungrateful as a sector. We knew the amount of work that had gone into the fund by colleagues in DCMS and Treasury. We knew the political capital that had been expended by politicians. But compared to, for example, the arts sector as a proportion of the sector's overall income, it was not enough. It was too small. We also, as well as the announcement being slow, it took a long time to distribute the fund. On average, I think it was 61 days for a decision, and that compared to, on average, around a month to access support if you were a business applying to one of the business schemes. We felt that in making decisions, other DCMS sectors were perhaps prioritised over the sector at the start of the pandemic. And in terms of simple, we felt the scheme was perhaps unduly bureaucratic. We totally understand the need for proportionate due diligence, but charities are already a highly regulated sector by the Charity Commission for England and Wales. There was lots of detail required in applications, many of which were unsuccessful, and so wasted energy by charities that were trying to respond to the pandemic. And then at the beginning of the scheme, there were additional checks required by PwC. This was actually changed, so only grants over £10,000 were required to have those additional checks. But we didn't understand this because the National Lottery Community Fund is a very experienced funder, and we felt they were able to do the checks. I think the final thing I'd say is this was a crisis response fund, which was, as I say, welcome and needed, but many organisations needed to also stabilise. They weren't responding to the immediate crisis, and so they weren't eligible for this scheme. But they were still essential to the recovery of the country. And again, we make comparison with the youth fund that was set up, which was eligible for stabilisation funding. And so, many organisations that needed funding to keep running were not able to access this scheme.
Just touching on a couple of points you've mentioned there. One about the size and scope of the £750 million package. Was the NCVO invited to provide feedback on that before it was announced?
Generally, we didn't find out about announcements until a little bit too late to provide feedback. So in the case of the £750 million, in the run-up to it being announced, we heard conflicting messages from different parts of government, from different politicians that we had relationships with. In the event, the former CEO of NCVO actually had a phone call with the Chancellor just hours before it was announced, so giving us very little time to, well, no chance to input into the quantum, but very little time to prepare a response and to ready the voluntary sector for the response.
And you mentioned a moment ago the additional levels of bureaucracy in parts of the scheme. I understand a key element of the package was the £200 million Coronavirus Community Support Fund, which was distributed by the National Lottery Community Fund. Is that right?
That's right.
which conducted their own checks of applicants. But an additional layer of vetting was also required to be carried out by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you say that fund, in your statement, you say the fund lacked the necessary flexibility to be distributed at pace. Are you referring to those additional checks and vetting?
The additional checks and vetting, but the application process itself was still lengthy. It still required a lot of information about need and activities. As I say, we understand the need for proportional due diligence, but we do not feel that businesses were subject to the same level of scrutiny in seeking financial support as
How long did you have the extra element of the PwC checks, roughly?
I don't have that information to hand, but I know they did reverse that decision and made it so only applications over £10,000 would have those additional checks.
Are we talking days, weeks, months?
Weeks.
Did the government explain why those additional checks were required initially?
No, I don't recall having that explained to me. Other than that it's public money and there must be some scrutiny of the spending of public money.
The final element of the funding, around a £360 million fund, was distributed by a range of government departments and also some external agencies, as you set out in your statement. And you say they also experienced some difficulties and inefficiencies. Were they along the same lines or those additional problems?
Very similar in terms of needing to apply for funding, often lengthy processes, sometimes different requirements for different schemes. So similar.
So looking ahead in any future scheme, you would look to see those additional checks, the vetting, those aspects that slow down the money going to charities to be removed or confined to as limited as possible. Is that right?
I think it needs to be proportionate. As I say, public funding needs to have some level of scrutiny, but given we were in a crisis and charities were having to make impossible decisions and needing to step up and respond, it felt unduly onerous, the process that charities had to go through to secure those funds. And for some of them, it was just too late.
Thank you. I now want to move to ask you about the wider measures brought in, so not just those specific to your sector. In your statement, you say the government adopted a one-size-fits-all approach to some business support schemes. What did you mean by that?
One of the things that we continually came up against was an assumption that because charities were organisations, they were the same as businesses, which is that while there are some similarities, there are many really important differences between charities and businesses. And we tried throughout the early stage of the pandemic to get this message across to different parts of government. And given what came out in terms of the business support schemes, we didn't feel that this was always consistently understood.
So can we look at some examples? Can we start with the coronavirus job retention scheme? Did it work well for some charities?
For some charities, it did work well. And I think it's fair to say we know after the event that many charities did make use of the scheme. But the fundamental flaw with the scheme was that charities, unlike businesses, so I've used the example of a pub or a cinema, which could just close. Charities couldn't just close their doors. It's not in a charity's nature to close its doors when there is such increasing need in communities. And so charities were faced with the choice of furloughing their staff and protecting their organisations' financial health for the long term, or stepping up to meet the need in communities, which is what most organisations did. For some charities, some parts of the organisation were quite suitable to the furlough scheme. So, for example, organisations which run charity shops, which couldn't open, could furlough those charity shop staff. And we know from our research that just under 40% of charities actually use the scheme. One of the biggest barriers, though, was that charities, when they furloughed their staff, those staff could volunteer for other organisations, but they couldn't volunteer for their own organisation. And indeed, this was one of the changes that we proposed as a work around the scheme, so charities were able to continue to deliver those vital services.
And I think one of the changes you proposed in January 21 or sought was a targeted furlough type scheme for your sector. Is that right?
That's right. I think our primary argument was that we needed a stabilisation fund that was specific for the voluntary sector. But failing that, the furlough scheme, we called for it to be amended so that charities could continue to deliver.
And what sort of response did you get from those requests?
It's difficult to say, because I think that probably speaks to the challenge in communicating with the kind of decision-making heart of government during the pandemic. It was always second-hand through DCMS, who, as I say, worked tirelessly and worked in partnership with us. But they were the ones who were speaking to the Treasury and making these proposals for amendments. And generally, we were kind of caught in this circular situation where we would ask for something, we would be asked for data and evidence. We would try and find the data and evidence, and then it wouldn't be sufficient for what the Treasury needed. And so then we'd go away to find more data and evidence, and that would continue.
Can I just ask a question? You say there's a flaw with the furlough scheme. That because people who normally work for a charity couldn't volunteer for the charity when they were on furlough. That we all understood that. That was to try and stop companies or businesses from saying, right, you're on furlough, now come back and work for us. And I'm afraid there were companies that did that. So is it necessarily a flaw with the scheme, or it's a flaw with what you say is the package of support should be available? Because it depends, does it not, on what your policy objective is with the furlough scheme?
I completely agree with what you've just said. I think, for me, it's just a demonstration of why the furlough scheme wasn't really suitable for charities. We needed to keep working. We couldn't really mothball in the way that some businesses could. In the event, some charities did choose to mothball because they tried to preserve that part of the organisation for the longer term. But in practice, what the sector needed was something much more targeted and specific that enabled us to continue our operations through the pandemic.
Thank you.
Moving to another scheme, please, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. I think you say some of your members and charities had difficulties accessing that scheme in particular. Why was that?
So in the first instance, it was challenging, well, if not impossible, for many charities to access the scheme, because to access the scheme, you needed to deliver over half of your turnover from trading. That would be quite unusual for most charities to receive over half of their income from trading, although there will be some examples. And so we lobbied quite strongly for this rule to be lifted, and indeed it was lifted.
Around the end of April, I think.
Yeah, that's correct.
Changed. So in any future version of that scheme, you'd like to see that restriction for charities lifted from the outset, is that right?
That's right. Although I think it's probably important to say that any sort of loan scheme is not what we would have advocated for charities, first and foremost, because many charities either cannot take on debt because of what's written into their articles and governing documents, or they would choose not to, because, again, charities are not aiming to make a profit, and at a time of such crisis, for a board of trustees to make a decision to take on debt would be potentially, it depends on the circumstances, quite risky, not knowing when operations would start again and when that debt could be paid back.
I think that's now the second example we've touched upon where, as a result of feedback which you and yours and other organisations has given, amendments have been made to the schemes in charities' favour. Does that demonstrate that government was listening?
I think parts of government listened to some of the things that we said. As I say, we worked with some very, very hard-working officials at the time who really wanted to work with the sector and did understand the role the sector were playing and the constraints, but that was not universal across Whitehall or across government.
And the third scheme I want to touch upon with you is the Small Business Grant Fund, which was part of the first cohort of business grants. And you say in your statement that this fund inadvertently sidelined charities. Why was that?
So charities pay a special have a special business rate relief, charitable business rate relief, and to access the Small Business Grant Fund, you had to be in receipt of small business rate relief, or I think there was a rural rate relief as well that made you eligible. So charities were not eligible for that scheme.
That position, following your organisation's feedback and some other organisations, that was amended though, wasn't it? And I think an additional discretionary fund was announced in May 20, which charities were eligible for, is that right?
That's correct, yes. There was a discretionary fund set up that was for small businesses and specifically included charities.
So although that wasn't tailored to charities initially, improvements again were made following feedback and government or parts of government listening to your organisation and others.
Yeah, we were pleased to see that, although in the event, and we don't have robust data on the extent of the use of the scheme, but from the anecdotal evidence we have from members, the way this discretionary fund was administered was that local authorities were asked to identify priority organisations in their areas. And although we know some members and some wider sector organisations were able to access this fund, we know of many more that were not prioritised by local authorities and didn't have access to this scheme.
Thank you. The final part of your evidence I want to touch upon are lessons learned and recommendations. And you set out a number in your statement, and I just want to touch upon a couple of those. You ask that in any future scheme or schemes in a pandemic, design features take into account the economic model and also the needs of charities so that there aren't those restrictions in accessing support. How do you think that's best approached?
Sorry, could you just repeat the beginning of that question?
So how do you think support schemes could be the best, most effectively targeted towards the charity sector?
Well, I think the most important thing to underpin the development of any charitable scheme is the development of a much better understanding across Whitehall of the voluntary sector, both in terms of what its value is kind of economically, preventatively, socially, but also understanding kind of the nature of how charities work, how reserves work, what it means to be not-for-profit and governed by a board of trustees. And so I think investing in that understanding and therefore relationships would mean that at a much earlier stage, charities could be taken into consideration and understood in terms of the value of the sector in supporting responding to a crisis, but crucially in recovering from a crisis and in the longer term in terms of the social and economic health of the country.
And which brings me to the second point I wanted to explore with you. You say this foundational understanding needs to be improved, both now and also in any future pandemic, and also that your organisation wanted to work with government as a trusted partner. How do you think that's best achieved in a future pandemic? Ad hoc communication, a more structured forum, for example?
A much more structured forum, and we're really pleased that since the pandemic and over the last few years, there's been the development of a new civil society covenant, which is intended to underpin trusting relationships between the sector and government, so that the sector can play all of the various roles that it does play, both in terms of public service delivery, but also giving voice to communities. And my understanding is there will now be a regular forum between voluntary sector leaders and the Treasury, which I think is absolutely crucial, because in designing any economic support measures, whether it's the regular budget or in a crisis, the Treasury will be a key decision maker, and not having those relationships, in my view, really hampered our ability to influence the development of those schemes.
Thank you, Miss Elliott. Those are all the questions I had.
And there are no other questions. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Hood. I'm very grateful for your help. And don't worry about speaking quickly. Stenographer's used to it because I speak very quickly. But thank you very much indeed for the help in providing the written statement and, of course, coming along today. Really
Thank
grateful.
you. Thank you.
I wouldn't normally break, but Mr. Wright, I gather there's a reason I need to break at this stage.
I think so briefly, yes.
How long?
No, only 5 minutes would suffice.
Well, we'll do 10. I'll come back at 15:15. Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you, my lady. The next witness is Sir Oliver Dowden.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please sit down.
Welcome back, Sir Oliver.
Thank you.
Sir Oliver, you've provided a statement to this module of the inquiry. The reference is INQ 000588159. And you have also provided today, I think, a short statement making a couple of corrections. Can we deal with those first of all? And then this statement will formally be entered into the inquiry. But just to deal with them, I think, first of all, at paragraph 103E of your original statement, you refer to a sum of money as £130 million, but in fact, should that have been £310 million?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 108 of your original statement, you refer to an instruction given to policy officials on the 18th of March 2020. That should have been the 18th of November 2020.
Yes, that's correct.
And then paragraph 110 of the original statement was included in error and should not have been read within the context of that section of the statement, because that paragraph relates not to coronavirus job retention scheme, but to the self-employed income support scheme, which you dealt with at paragraph 124.
Yes, it's a repetition, a mistaken repetition.
Yep. Thank you very much. Will those corrections having been dealt with, I want to ask you questions about your role as Secretary of State in the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And the first topic I'd like to cover with you, if I may, please, is just to understand how operationally you adapted the structures within the department, particularly with a focus on the economic response as it affected the sectors that you were responsible for. So if we can start by looking at that, please. Now, we know that prior to 2021, that the Civil Society and Youth Directorate was known as the Office for Civil Society. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And that was responsible for policy relating to charities, volunteering, social action, and so on.
Yes, that's correct.
And did the Office for Civil Society therefore continue to feed into you as Secretary of State throughout the pandemic?
Yes, it did.
And did it feed into you concerns relevant to the sector it represented relating to the economic response of the government?
Yes, it did, yes. Alongside other parts of my department as well.
Yes, and I'm going to come on to those. There was also a team known as the Strategy, Policy and Fiscal Events Team, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you described that as really being the central coordinating team for COVID-19 related policy and commissions, is that?
Yes, certainly in the initial period. I think I then set out how that subsequently changed as time went on.
Yeah. So was that a pre-existing team?
Yes, it was.
That had ordinary functions in ordinary time?
Yes, so essentially it was the sort of the the principal fiscal advisory unit, for want of a better word, within the department. So that would typically deal with the department's engagement, for example, with the Treasury in response to budgets and other fiscal events and other related activities. So there was a sort of natural transition for its role during COVID.
So there would be established channels that existed before the pandemic for liaison with the Treasury and interaction with the Treasury on economic matters that affected the department.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And so, as you say, naturally, that was a good starting point for liaison, was it?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And in the early stages, that team, did that team engage with the Treasury about the design of general support, economic support?
Yes, it did. As I'm sure I appreciate, the Treasury, in respect of the pan economy measures, I think I sometimes refer to them as horizontal measures in my witness statement, was the principal or was the decision maker in respect of those measures, and then other government departments engaged with them as appropriate, and my department did so extensively through them. I should also say it sat alongside other engagement, including from my political advisor, special advisors with their political opposite numbers in the Treasury, and of course my personal engagement with the Chancellor and others.
Just so that everyone watching your evidence understands the way, the terms you're using in terms of pan-economic and horizontal measures. Do you mean by that these are measures that the Treasury was taking that were designed to provide support to the economy in general? These were not sector-specific measures. These were if you like, the big-ticket items, the big things that the Treasury was doing for the economy as a whole.
Yes, that's correct. And very early on in the pandemic, once the government had introduced all the restrictions that everyone is familiar with, it was apparent that that would have a profound impact on many, many parts of the economy. And so the decision taken by the Chancellor, and indeed collectively by the Cabinet, was that the principal means of dealing with that should be by measures that could be accessible to all, or as many as possible. So pan across the economy.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. And then you also speak in your statement about establishing the COVID-19 hub. And just so we understand, that is internal to your department, is that right?
Yes, all of this is the sort of wiring of my department.
Yeah. And you describe that as having what you've called a cross-cutting function, coordination function. Can you just expand a little bit and put that into simple language in terms of what it was actually doing?
Yes, sorry, it's a slightly jargon term.
Don't worry.
What I mean by that is that it was engaging across different parts of the department, and indeed would also work with other relevant government departments as appropriate. So it would pull together all the relevant information and analysis. I think it's also just important, if I may add, in terms of my position as Secretary of State, I would tend to commission advice, or advice would be given to me. The key thing for me was the advice as requested through my permanent secretary and indeed my private office. So there wasn't a huge amount of distinction as to which different bit of the department it came from. The question I was always asking myself was, is this giving me the information that I require in order to discharge my duties as Secretary of State?
I see. So there is a final filter, doesn't really matter where it's originating from, of the information that then comes to you for decision-making and direction of policy. Is that?
Yes. So everything that I received as a minister in a written format would come to my private office. My private office would then take that advice, and they would provide a cover note which would summarise the nature of the decisions I had to take and so on. Also, additional advice would be provided both from the private office in terms of their perspective on what the key issues were, and almost always, except in a few national security related issues, it would have advice from political advisors as well on it. Okay. Then the other forms of advice I would receive would generally be orally in meetings or telephone calls, but again the private office would engage with different parts of the department to determine who was the most appropriate person to attend that meeting or to provide advice over the telephone.
So we've dealt with the strategy, policy and fiscal events team, pre-existing, had established lines of communication with the Treasury, and so a good starting point. You established the COVID-19 hub, but is it right you also established the Economic Response Directorate, known as the ERD?
Yes.
And that was established on the 23rd of March. And did that have, as its name perhaps suggests, an economically focused responsibility?
Yes, that's correct, and became one of the principal way in which we dealt with the Treasury.
Okay.
In respect of COVID-related interventions.
Yeah. But just looking at those different bodies, how were they working together? We've got there 3 teams: strategy, policy and fiscal events, COVID-19 hub, economic response directorate, pre-existing 4th office for civil society. How was that all working together? It may sound that's 4 things doing 4 different bodies doing similar things. How did you see it?
Well, as I say, the first way in which I saw it was, am I getting the right information? So as I think I set out in my witness statement, and I believe that Sam Lister sets out in his witness statement as well, the principal responsibility for the organisation of the department and the delivery of what we're seeking to achieve lay through the Permanent Secretary, and so I would rely on the Permanent Secretary's advice in respect of that. The second thing is that I would engage in a number of different ways. First of all, I've set out how I engage with the private office. So everything went through the filter of the private office, so they coordinated with the appropriate bits of the department that I needed advice from. I also met on at least a weekly basis with both the Permanent Secretary and with the relevant Director Generals. And in particular, Sam Lister, as the Director General, sort of oversaw all these different cross-cutting elements. So I was confident that it went up a Whitehall hierarchy that went through Sam Lister as the DG to the Permanent Secretary. I met with both of those people, and then there was the filter of the private office.
I mean, I suppose the important thing for you as the ultimate decision maker, did you ever feel that you were getting conflicting advice from different teams, or that they weren't working well together, or rather did you feel that each was complementing the other, doing slightly different things, but ultimately leading to coherent advice to you? How did it appear at the time?
And I think that's a very important question, and I'm sure I never felt there was conflicting advice. One shouldn't view these as being sort of different fiefdoms or baronetcies. They were all playing their role and I think it's worth also just appreciating that this was a function of the department pivoting to this COVID crisis situation, where suddenly as a department we were dealing with all these different bits that the department was responsible for. So the DCMS, and even more so at the time I was Secretary of State, had a very wide range of responsibilities, going through telecommunications to the newspaper industry, sports, civil society, arts, culture, and so on. And we were trying to coordinate our response to all those different sectors, all of whom had significant needs.
I mean, your experience of government, is that array of sectors for which you were responsible, is that unusual for a department to have that sort of breadth of different sectors, ranging from, say, the charity sector all the way through to telecommunications and media?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think the other department that used to be much more like that was the Home Office. And if one wants to get into the sort of history of all of this, I believe that the department was hived off of the Home Office at one point because the Home Office had such a wide variety of different responsibilities. And just fast forwarding slightly to the department acquired responsibility for digital, I believe, of business before I became Secretary of State, and civil society has sat in other parts of government, including in the Cabinet Office.
So what I'm really trying to understand is whether it was the breadth of the sectors that your department was responsible for that necessitated different bodies within the department feeding in advice on different issues.
I think it was more, in terms of the creation of these different units, and particularly the COVID hub, This was more a reflection of the department stepping up to a new role, which was about how can we support these different sectors in two respects. One, the impact of them from being locked down, or many of them from being locked down, and then so what the rules meant and so on and so forth. And then secondly, the support that they would then need from the government, principally financial support.
When it came to financial support, or when it comes to it, we're going to go on, and I'm going to ask you some questions about sector-specific support that was introduced. But was your focus on that, identifying what sector-specific support the department could offer, funded by the Treasury if necessary? Or was it on ensuring that the panic economic measures that the Treasury was introducing worked for your sectors, or both? I'd just be interested if you could help us with your strategy for that.
Yes, both and sequentially. So to begin with, it was to understand what the non-medical interventions that they use. I forget the terminology.
NPIs.
Exactly.
Yes.
The non-pharmaceutical interventions. Yes. What the non-pharmaceutical interventions meant for our sectors. And there was a lot of engagement with the sectors in respect of that. Then, as it became apparent that lots of the non-pharmaceutical interventions would have potentially an existential threat, present an existential threat to those sectors, it was understanding what that actually meant and the scale of the support they needed. Then it became apparent from our engagement, particularly with the Treasury and the discussions that we were having, including collectively as ministers in the government, that the first line and the principal means of response was these pan-economic measures. So at that stage, it was making sure that those applied to as many of our sectors as possible. That certainly wasn't a given at the beginning, so we wanted to make sure that was the case. Once we then understood where it applied and where the gaps might emerge, we then started to engage more in terms of what sector-specific interventions might be required. Hence the charity support package of £750 million, the Cultural Recovery Fund, and all the other sector-specific packages that we engaged with.
Okay. So in terms of those significant pan-economic measures, we're talking, are we, about things like the job retention scheme, self-employed income support scheme, loan schemes, grants, and business rate relief, those sorts of schemes that are applying across the economy.
PAY deferral is another one, yeah.
Yeah. So first focus is see what the Treasury is delivering and see how that might apply to our sector and how we can try and ensure that it does apply to our sector. And then look for gaps that are emerging or areas that might need additional support and see whether we can land schemes that are specific to our sector or sectors.
Yes, that is correct, yes.
Okay. Now, can we look first of all at some of that sector support, and in particular support for the voluntary community and social enterprise sector. And I'm just going to ask, please, if we could have up on the screen INQ 000623 and it's page 1. There we are. Thank you.
Yes.
I think this is from the 18th of March of 2020. So this is a submission to you as Secretary of State. And if we could just focus on the recommendation. This was a recommendation on the 18th of March that essentially you should request of the Treasury £2 billion of funding to deliver a proposed package of support, which was a £1 billion UK Community Mobilisation Fund to ensure mission-critical parts of the voluntary sector are able to respond to this emergency. And 2, a £1 billion stabilisation fund to prevent large-scale closures of charities that provide direct support for the most vulnerable people in our communities, such as hospices. So just so we understand this is coming to you from the Office for Civil Society, is that right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah. And it's essentially a suggestion that you should be going to the Treasury at that stage and saying, can we have £2 billion of funding split in that way to be delivered by the department? So this is funding, just so we're clear, is it that was being suggested you should ask for in addition to all the pan-economic measures that you've touched on?
No, I don't believe it was. And I think if you look at the sequencing of it, that's dated the 18th. I don't think the pan economy measures were announced, I think maybe till the 25th. From recollection. So this was prior to the pan economy measures.
I see. So this was a sort of early pitch as to what you should be going to ask for.
So it's worth bearing in mind, because things moved so quickly during the COVID crisis. We were simultaneously engaging with the Treasury about the pan economy measures, not knowing exactly what the pan economy measures looked like, but also the Office for Civil Society was engaging with the charitable sector and others. And this is them coming to me and saying, through my private office and so on, this is what we would recommend as a package of direct support in the way described in para 3A.
Okay, so this is Office for Civil Society engaging with the charity sector. This is the if you like, the early bid of what they are telling them they think they're going to need, and coming to you and asking for you to make that case to the Treasury. What was your reaction to that, your response to that request at that early stage?
Well, the first thing I should say is that unfortunately we haven't been able to get through the department the cover note. So typically this would come with a cover note with the advice from my private secretary, advice from my special advisor, and then I would write on that cover note my response to that. We have been unable to track that down. However, my recollection is that I came back and asked for, and I would say it will almost always be the case if I was given a submission like this, asking for £2 billion of taxpayers' money to be spent. I'm pretty sure I went back and asked some further questions about exactly how we derived these numbers, who it was seeking to benefit, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly say, I think it's paragraph 84 of your statement, that you had concerns on that submission. And were those essentially the concerns, that this was a lot of money to be asking for at that stage?
Yes, I mean, it was a lot of money to be asking for, full stop, and certainly as the Secretary of State, I would not want to sign off on such a large request, even though it was essentially first stage going to the Treasury, until I had full confidence in it. So I believe, and as I set out in my statement, as you say, I asked questions of this because it was a significant amount of money, and to get further detail.
Now, at any time, what sort of things are you balancing as Secretary of State when requests for funding, particularly that sort of level, are being made to you?
So I'm considering the needs of the sector. I'm considering whether it represents value for money. I'm considering how we would distribute this. I'm considering, is there deadweight cost? That is to say that there's some other scheme that is already providing it, so we could be replicating that. I'm also all the time thinking of my constituents and the people that elected all of us, who will end up, it'll be their taxes that pay for it. Is this getting the balance right? Is it A, effective, and is it B, proportionate to the need?
Presumably, if you don't ask questions like that as Secretary of State, you're going to lose credibility with HMT for any other funding requests.
Yes, both with HMT and indeed with Parliament, to whom I'd have to justify almost all of these things. So you end up being called before a select committee and so on. So I had to be very confident that this was the right amount of money that I was requesting.
Was there, from your perspective, additional concern that this was a bid for a very large sum of money, even before you knew what the Treasury was going to actually announce in terms of support and how that support would be delivered?
Yes, of course. I mean, as I said, there was a sort of, and it's a little difficult to recall exactly the sequencing in my thoughts at the time, but I'm aware that we were in parallel engaging with the pan economy measures. So clearly, it would have, and I think this is what transpires in the subsequent piece of evidence that I have submitted and the inquiry has, that we then took into account the effect of the pan economy measures in refining this number.
Yeah. Well, I think it was on the 25th of March 2020. It's INQ 0006235559, please, and page 1. If we look at number 4 there, in light of the Treasury's comments, the economic support package and other government announcements, we recommend seeking funding for a smaller package now, to which we could add later if needed. There's a balance between going to HMT with a number that we think they will agree and pushing for a larger number that the sector wants. We recommend an initial package on this scale is deliverable. And then it sets out a small allocation to a National Emergencies Trust of 10 million and a larger boost of 500 million new money to the National Lottery Community Fund. So that's a week on from the previous document we looked at, but in that intervening week, you know more about what the Treasury is doing. Is that fair?
Yes, that is correct, yes.
Yeah. And so that became the advice. And how did you react to that advice?
I seem to recall, and again, I do have to say the caveat that I would have liked to be able to have seen the actual physical box notes, that it was sort of hoving into broadly the right sort of amount given the pan economy measures. The other thing that I recall at the time was that the decision was taken by the Treasury, but collectively agreed across government that we'd have these pan economy measures. So therefore, the focus of this became more, okay, so the bits of the charitable sector that are going to carry on delivering in response to COVID, how do we support them in doing that?
So was that part of the equation that you were in particular looking at supporting those parts of the sector, or prioritising rather than looking to support, prioritising those parts of the charitable sector that were going to be playing that part in the response to COVID?
Yes, and indeed, if one looks at the overall package and the breakdown of that as it transpired, a lot of it was in response to what we saw as being pinch points in respect of that.
And the inquiry understands that on the 8th of April 2020, so we're moving forward a couple more weeks in a timeline of rapidly moving events, the Chancellor announced a £750 million emergency funding package to support the sector. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And you described that in your statement as a figure that had been reached by negotiation between your department, the Department of Health and Social Care, and the Treasury. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. And of course, it is also worth noting, for completeness, that a package of this size would also attract the interest of 10 Downing Street as well.
Yes, thank you. So that was £750 of additional monies and a support in addition to the pan economic support that you've described.
Yes, 750 million, yes.
Sorry, did I say
you missed off the million. Yes.
Well, what's a million between friends, I could say, but no, that's an important correction, so thank you. Can you assist at all in terms of how that figure was arrived at? I mean, is it more scientific of you pushed for what you could get and that was, given the other fiscal response of the government, what was available?
So it was I would say a combination of three things. So first of all, as we have discussed, the interaction between the pan economy measures and the needs of the sector. Secondly, it was specific needs from the response to COVID. So if one looks at the breakdown, particularly with the other government departments of areas where we spent money, £200 million was for hospices. There was an awful lot of attention at the time about the pressure that was on hospices. Even smaller numbers, I believe there's some money that goes to zoos. There was a lot of pressure at the time about how zoos were responding to this crisis. So there was that kind of analysis. And of course, in that context, a large chunk of it from my department came from the engagement that the Office for Civil Society had with the sector, understanding the needs and so on as set out. And then, of course, finally, there is an element of the art of the possible, that is to say what the Treasury is going to agree to. And I don't mean that to be dismissive of the Treasury, because the Treasury is the only department across the whole of government whose sole focus is on the totality of government expenditure. So they have to make the ultimate decision about how expenditure on individual schemes sets in the context of the whole of government expenditure and how that's paid for, whether it's through taxes, the bond issuance, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the number, the amount of money, we've heard evidence this morning that the sector considered that the amount of money available was not adequate. It wasn't a sufficient sum of money, and the inquiry has received evidence. For example, that it was estimated that the charity sector would lose £3.69 billion of income within 12 weeks of the first lockdown. Were you thinking about this package and the sum of money in terms of what was adequate, in other words, what would replace pound for pound the money that was lost, or were you thinking about it in a different way?
I was thinking about it in a slightly different way. So, and indeed, the position that was agreed with the Treasury collectively was the principal means of supporting all organisations, whether they were businesses, charities, and so on, was through the pan economy measures. So that was the sort of baseline. And then I was thinking in respect of this sum about how it would address the specific needs of the sector, but specifically through the lens of those activities that were required to support people, and the hugely important role that the charitable sector played in supporting people through the COVID crisis.
Thank you. It's been suggested in evidence from Sarah Elliott from the National Council for Voluntary Organisations that the amount of money could or should be compared to the amount of money that was being given to other sectors, and that it fell below that being given to other sectors. For example, her statement refers to the 1.57 billion that was provided to the arts and culture sector. I'll just give you an opportunity to deal with that. Were you viewing, you had a lot of sectors, were you viewing this as a competition between sectors or an allocation between sectors? Were you having to balance one against the other? How were the amounts of money being determined?
No, each sector was considered on its own merits and according to its needs. It is worth noting that in respect of the comparison Sarah Elliott makes with the COVID recovery scheme for the cultural bailout, the Cultural Recovery Fund, that I believe was allocated about 3 months later. So at the time we had more of a picture of where that sector was. Remember that this package that we agreed with the Treasury in respect of the charitable sector was almost immediately after lockdown had been announced. We didn't know exactly how things were going to transpire over the coming months. Nobody knew how things were going to transpire over the coming months. So they were very different packages at different times with different needs. And I mean, I could go through the needs of the the 1.57 billion, how that was derived, it was a totally different set of circumstances.
Thank you. Can I just take a slight detour from the theme of my questions, just to pick this up here, because I think it's probably as convenient a place to do so, because I've just asked you a question about that cultural sector. You established in May of 2020 the Cultural Renewal Task Force, is that right?
Yes.
And you chaired that yourself, I think.
Yes, I believe I did, yes.
Yeah. What was the remit of that task force? And can you just help us with why you created it?
So I believe that I established that, first of all, to properly understand the pressures that the sector was under. Remember, this is the cultural sector was very diverse. It spanned everything through film and television, museums, galleries, the commercial theatre sector, the publicly funded theatre sector. So to understand what their needs were, both in respect of what financial support they might need, but also whether it was viable for them to continue to operate, because, as you may recall, at different times during the COVID pandemic, we had different restrictions, the 2 meters, the indoor, outdoors, helping them to find a way through to see whether there was any cultural activity that could happen in the context of the rules that stood at the time.
Having established it, did you think it was beneficial? Did it assist you to do that?
Yes, it did. Yes, I mean, I found all engagement with the multiplicity of sectors that I dealt with helpful. It's one of the sources of information that I drew on, amongst many others, in making decisions I had to make as Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you. Can I pick that up then as a theme, the issue of consultation? Again, Sarah Elliott, in her witness statement and touched on in her evidence, has raised the issue that the sector really only became aware of the support package shortly before it was announced, and the details just hours in advance, and that there wasn't really, she would say, sufficient consultation with her organisation and therefore with the sector about the design of the support. What would you say to that as a complaint, if that's the right word?
Well, first of all, I appreciate her concerns. And in a normal world, when we were designing a £750 million package like this, it would have taken months and would have been the principal focus of my department. And so, in normal circumstances, I would have expected us to have several rounds of consultation and engagement to refine it. We didn't have that luxury in COVID. We wanted to get the money out of the door very, very quickly. And as you can see from the chronology, there was a very short period of time between the announcement of the lockdown and their package being announced. It was the first one out of the door. It is also always the case, though, that the Treasury is very reluctant to engage on the specifics of proposals until they are finally agreed, because it's the nature of policy making, particularly with the Treasury, that schemes change and then they change again, so they don't wish to set hares running or false expectations that then mean that people don't fully understand where they are in terms of the support. It is worth noting, though, that there was engagement. I was able to listen to some of Sarah Everett's evidence. It was very kind of her to make reference to my officials and how she and her team engaged extensively with them. That, in turn, was feeding through to me and feeding through to the Treasury, both me directly and through the directly from civil servants to civil servants. And it's also the case that I did engage with the sector. I had a round table with them, and crucially, I had an excellent junior minister in Diana Barron, Baroness Barron, who had experience of the charitable sector, who did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of engagement with them, and was a very valuable source of advice to me as well.
So to summarise your answer, there was consultation, and that was going on all the time with the sector. But given the pace and the need for the Treasury to sign off on the package and formally announce it, that there wasn't a blow-by-blow consultation on the precise shape of what was going to be announced. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Generally, did you find that the greater the consultation, that the better schemes landed and support landed, or was that not your experience?
Well, yeah, yes and no. So it's important to recall that engagement with the sector is just one way in which we derive information. So we would derive information from the experience and expertise of the officials in my department, many of whom have either worked in the sector or had been engaging with the sector for many, many years. We derive advice and information from reports that were prepared on the sector, official statistics. So all of this came together. Of course, if we had enough time, more consultation is always better. But as a department and as a government, we had to trade off the time for consultation with the speed of the response.
Thank you. Now, the monies that became available, the additional monies, were delivered through a number of different schemes. I think 7 in total. Is that right?
Yes.
We can take it as read. Why deliver the monies across lots of different schemes rather than have one central scheme that could provide support?
Well, it was to reflect the different needs of the sector. So the fund that was allocated to other government departments was a reflection of specific needs, principally that had already been identified by those departments. Those departments had the existing relationships. So, for example, DHSC had the relationship with the hospices sector. Taking another example, I've used DEFRA would have had the relationship with the zoo, so it made more sense for them, having had those relationships, to get money out to those specific sectors. Additionally, if you look at the breakdown, there was also, we had match funding. So, for example, I think we had the big night in Children in Need. So we were aware that by providing that match funding, we were able to get more money in. And then we also, for example, had the funding for the VSCE, which was about essentially lubricating the system in terms of understanding more about the sector. So they needed support for that. And then we had the principal package that was the responsibility of the department, which was the £310 million charities package.
Do you think there was a danger in that approach to delivering funding that different departments were bidding for their own sectors and effectively promoting the interests of their own sectors, and that there was any lack of transparency about who made ultimately the decision as to what money went where?
No, I don't think that was the case, because there were just certain sectors that very easily sat with a given government department. Those departments then put bids into this decision-making mechanism that we set up, a sort of star chamber, and then collective decisions were made in respect of those bids by a combination principally of DCMS and the Treasury, which you would expect to be the case. In all of this, we were seeking to get money out the door as quickly as we could to the sectors that needed it most, but at the same time trying to build a structure around it that was defensible to the public whose money we were spending.
Now, if you think about it in ordinary times, and there's a spending review and different departments make bids for money from the Treasury, I mean, do you accept in that in ordinary times there is an element of competition, if you like, between departments as to who can secure their funding for their programmes going forwards?
Well, I suppose there's an implicit competition, but it's not really how it feels from an individual department. What you do for an individual department is go through the needs of your department and make the case to the Treasury for your department. I was never particularly concerned in any spending review or budgetary process about the bids from other departments. That was for the Treasury to make the decision. I was concerned about the needs of the department that I represented to ensure that appropriate funds were given to them.
So as far as you're concerned, this Star Chamber, as you've called it, effectively worked as a way of departments could come and identify sectors that are in particular need, and then the funding could be distributed.
Yes, and it's important to remember, first of all, it's always the case that as a government we're interested in the whole interest of the nation and the government over the individual departmental interests. That was even more so the case during this once-in-a-generation crisis.
I mean, I've already touched on the sum of money that was available, but just to give you an opportunity to deal with the criticism that was made this morning that this just wasn't enough money, what would you say to that?
Well, first of all, the number of people touched by these various schemes, I believe, was about 21 million people, one way or another. So we managed to use a colloquialism, quite a lot of bang for our buck from it. Secondly, it was the case that within a year or two, contrary to many of the concerns that had been raised, we didn't see a wholesale collapse of the charitable sector. The number of charities ceasing to exist, I think it declined by about 1%, which I think was kind of roughly about where we would have expected. Although what I would say is, of course, as the responsible Secretary of State, I always wanted to get more money for the sectors for which I represented and I was passionate about. But I think I feel reasonably comfortable that it was it was a defensible package, but B, it did have a profound impact on many, many people.
The Coronavirus Community Support Fund, can I just ask a couple of questions about that? Do you accept or recognise the concern that it lacked flexibility?
No, I'm afraid, I think is the short answer. I just have to be honest with you.
Well, we obviously prefer honest answers. So
every answer is honest, I should say.
So why was it
colloquialism.
why was it configured as it was from your perspective?
So is this the point about the alleged complexity of
yes.
it? Right. I was very cognizant at the time of the need to protect the interests of the taxpayer and to make sure that we had rigorous mechanisms in place to ensure that money was allocated properly. And indeed, without wanting to comment on any of the other allegations around it, I think with the passage of time, this has been one of the public's big concerns about, was the money spent wisely? So I'm glad that we took a rigorous approach to the allocation of public resources. This was still a huge amount of money, 300 odd million pounds that we were responsible for distributing.
So if we took a compare and contrast, say, between the support a business could get, apply for a bounce back loan, minimal scrutiny, and furlough staff, as against additional layers of not complexity but requirements that had to be met for this fund, would you say that the introduction of requirements was a good thing in that it was looking after public money? Or would you say you're comparing two different things, really, in terms of support? Well,
I can only really speak to the schemes for which I was responsible, and I felt that it was appropriate. Particularly, it's worth noting in this context that many of the organisations that were receiving money were receiving it for the first time. They weren't experienced with receiving it. They had limited experience of managing government funds. It included non-registered new organisations that were being given rapid emergency funding. So the judgment that I took was that it was proportionate to have this additional layer. However, as things transpired, I was always mindful of making it proportionate, and I received representations that for relatively small amounts of money, we should raise the threshold to £10,000. I felt that on balance that was a proportionate approach. But again, I think that I personally felt more comfortable with having more rigour to begin with and then easing off on the rigour than the other way around. And so one final point worth making is that if you look at the surveys that have been conducted subsequently, and I'm happy to write to the inquiry with the details of those, I believe about 3/4 of those surveyed who applied for funds under the scheme found that it was reasonably simple and straightforward. So it wasn't out of the normal bounds of what they might expect for applying to a government scheme.
Accepting that one person's rigour might be another person's layer of unnecessary complexity, depending on your perspective. Can I ask you about the National Lottery Community Fund? That was a fund that was long established. Do you accept?
Yes.
And had a long history of delivering grant funding. It knew what it was doing in ordinary times.
Yes, but it is worth noting that the scale and speed and volume of this was much, much greater than what they would deal with in normal times. So they were being asked to take on an enormous new workload in a very short period of time.
So why, if they were familiar with delivering that sort of support, bring in external consultants, PricewaterhouseCoopers, paying them, I think the estimate was about £1.4 million to do what the fund already knew how to do?
Well, first of all, for the reasons I set out, that these organisations had limited experience of managing government funds, there were non-registered new organisations, and secondly, because the scale and speed of what we were asking them to do, I took the judgment at the time that an additional layer of scrutiny would be appropriate, and as I said, when that proved not to be required in respect of those smaller sums, the department showed flexibility, or we showed flexibility in respect of it. Of course, it's always the case that as a minister, you're trading off things. You're trading off speed, rigour, complexity. But I suppose I don't. If one looks at the evidence of the people that experienced the scheme, their feedback, even afterwards, was that 3/4 of them found this was a reasonably normal level of scrutiny. And indeed, £1.4 million, although it's a large sum of money, in the context of a £300-odd million scheme, I think that would be broadly in the sort of boundaries of what one might expect around administrative costs.
So did you view that not as adding complexity so much as ensuring delivery in a time of a massive increase in applications and need?
Yes, well, I was very mindful of the fact that we were giving lots and lots of money to organisations that we didn't know terribly well, and that I wanted some more reassurance, not for me personally, but for the government as a whole, and indeed the taxpayer.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I move on then to the second significant topic, which is your department's engagement with and feedback on the economy measures. We've dealt with the funds that were set up, the new money, but your engagement with the wider measures that are applying across the economy, please. I think you had some particular concerns, is that right, about different aspects of the pan-economic measures so far as they affected your sector or sectors?
Yes, well, one of my responsibilities and the department's responsibilities was to engage with all the relevant sectors for which we were responsible, pick up their concerns, analyse those concerns, and if we felt that those concerns were legitimate and had merit, to engage with the Treasury about those concerns. Okay.
Can I just pick up a couple of concerns, I think, that arose from the job retention scheme? If we could have up, please, INQ 000 623 481, page 3 of that. Yep. This was advice to you from the Economic Response Directorate of the 27th of March of 2020. And this was raising issues about 0 hours workers who are not on the PAYE payroll, arrangements for employers which are not able to cease trading or close down their services, and then give some examples: tourism companies, and at the bottom there, charities which are delivering the same or additional level of services as they would in normal circumstance, but with significantly reduced income from individual giving and grants. What did you do with that advice to take forward those concerns?
And again, I just have to put the caveat on that I don't have the covering box notes, but what I would typically do, and I'm sure, and I remember some of these very well, would be to engage with the Treasury. If I felt that those were legitimate concerns, probably my first response would be to ask for some more detail on some of these things to make sure we were on solid ground, and I might question other schemes available had they thought about doing so and so on. If I still felt that was the case, I would seek to engage with the Treasury. The usual sort of hierarchy of engagement with the Treasury would be that I would instruct or request my officials to engage with their appropriate opposite numbers in the Treasury, see if they could get some movement there. Then if they didn't have some movement there, I'd ask my political advisors to engage through political channels, and then I would engage both with the Treasury or indeed with Number 10, because it's worth noting that in Downing Street there are private secretaries and policy officials that roughly sort of cover each individual government department. So we would engage with them as appropriate as well. So we would always try and do our best by the sectors for which we were responsible, but ultimately accepting that the Treasuries are the ultimate custodians, both of these schemes. They designed them, so they were responsible for them, and they were the ultimate custodians of public money.
Now, we heard this morning a concern raised about the fact that one of the features of the job retention scheme, particularly in the charity sector, was that you couldn't be furloughed and then volunteer within the charity that had furloughed you, though you could volunteer with another charity. And obviously that might sound like a good idea, but it might not match the skill of the charity worker with the particular charity. Rather than looking back over that, can we look forward? If there was ever a need for another job retention scheme, do you consider that a carve-out for the charity sector that would enable furlough of employees in the charity sector and volunteering within their own charity would be A, a good idea, B, deliverable?
Well, I made the case at the time extensively that they should be able to volunteer within their own sector. The legitimate pushback that we had from the Treasury was that how would that sit in terms of fraud? So the concern that probably less from the charitable sector, but from elsewhere, that companies could furlough someone and then get them to volunteer for that sector and sort of get benefit twice, both the furlough scheme and then the benefits of the services of that person. Of course, with the benefit of time, if we could design a scheme working with the Treasury with sufficient time that we could really test it, that it was robust enough, that we could find a way of enabling those charities to allow their staff to re-volunteer, I think it would have to specifically be to deliver specific COVID-related functions, then of course I'd like that to be the case. And we did try and find a way of doing it. We just never got to a point where the Treasury could be sufficiently satisfied that it met those concerns.
So you would say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're saying lots of good policy reasons generally why the Treasury would be concerned about that sort of ability to volunteer back for fraud reasons and so on and so forth. But the charity sector is a different sector, and if it could be done in a secure way that avoided the potential for fraud, that's something that you would support going forward.
Well, yes, both the potential for fraud, but also, again, there is a need to protect value for money for the taxpayer, because if it was the case that across all activities of a charitable sector, they were able to get the benefit of the furlough money, and then have all of their staff working, then I think that would probably put excessive demands on the public purse. So I think my inclination, what I'd hope we could try and get to a point, was to have it targeted at those delivering frontline services that were required at the time of the COVID crisis.
Yes, or any future crisis.
Indeed, any
yes.
future related crisis, of course.
Understood. So those who were delivering services that were tackling the immediate crisis, whatever that may be at the time, in an emergency sense.
Yes, and I should say, in defence of the Treasury, the Treasury can speak for itself, there wasn't a sort of lack of understanding from them about the issue. We just couldn't get to a point where it worked.
Yeah. Was there any sense in which there was a concern within government that the more complicated you started to make these schemes, and the ability of businesses or charities to apply for them, that would start to defeat the purpose of the scheme?
And of course, that was always a trade-off, and particularly when we were going back to the Treasury once the pan economy schemes had been designed, saying, can we tweak this or can we tweak that? Every iteration means, and this is how government works, a whole fresh set of guidance goes out, new rules, and you've already got organisations that are applying under an old scheme, then you put out new rules. It just makes things more challenging.
Thank you. Can I move on to the business interruption loan schemes? It's right, isn't it, that the concerns were raised with you that some charities were struggling to access funding through the loan schemes?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And what did you do in reaction to that?
Well, this was the point about, I think, 50% of their income needed to come from trading, and that was one of the areas where we were successful in convincing the Treasury to tweak the rules, which I think benefited a number of charities.
Yeah. We understand that after engagement, the Treasury prohibited lenders requiring personal guarantees, for example, and changed other elements, as you've said, of the 50% rule. And was that, in your view, a particular success for the charity sector? Was that what was driving your engagement with the Treasury on that?
Well, we were driven by doing what was right, and my belief was that this was a sensible change that would benefit the charitable sector, but it's also worth noting that the wider public benefit then of those organisations being able to draw on additional resources.
Can I then give you an opportunity to look ahead and share learning and reflections from your time as Secretary of State during the pandemic? I know you set out in your statement that generally you consider that the department stepped up well and obtained funding from the Treasury. Can I just ask you, first of all, about the COVID-19 analytical hub that you set up, and whether there were particular benefits from that hub, and if so, what they were and how they might apply going forwards?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we faced when COVID struck was that we had this very wide array of different sectors which we were responsible, some of whom we'd engage with more, others we'd engage with less, and most of them were putting new demands on us, rightly. They were asking us to provide support for them, to engage with the Treasury on their behalf. So we did find, in respect, particularly of those sectors that we didn't normally engage with in respect of that issue. So, for example, in the context we've been discussing charities, OCS wouldn't historically have engaged that much with charities about a direct funding package provided by DCMS to them. So it's certainly a lesson for me that we need in future it would have been better to have had more information about the specific needs of those sectors in respect of financial support that they might need. That in turn could have helped us in the earlier engagement with the Treasury, but more importantly going forward, when for the Treasury to sort of have a war book, as it were, of understanding these things in more detail. The analytic function was an attempt to improve our understanding across the board, and indeed I think I then subsequently appointed a director of analytics, I think in March or something of the following year. So that was one of the gaps that we sought to close up.
Did you find generally that first of all, that the analytical, or the quality of the analytical product you were getting got better over time?
Yes, broadly, yes. Of course, but if not for the simple fact that we just simply had more time to draw in more information and process it over time. In those very early days of the pandemic, we were trying to do a huge amount in a very, very short period of time.
And generally, did you find as Secretary of State that the better the analysis, the better the decisions that were made by the department?
Yes, I think probably the principal way in which that manifested itself was I'd go back asking less questions. So more questions would have been answered in the initial piece of advice, and so I'd have to request less information subsequently.
Do you think that there was a challenge in communicating and engaging with the vast number of businesses and sectors that fell under your remit? And if you do, is there anything that could be done going forwards to facilitate better engagement in a future emergency?
I think it's difficult to see how one could sort of square the circle, as it were, between having a very wide variety of different departments, areas which were responsible, and the short period of time that we had to engage with them. Every single one of them was making legitimate demands of us in terms of communications, from the newspapers that were worried that they were going to go bust because there were no physical newspapers being sold, to the broadband companies that thought that their infrastructure would crumble under the pressure of everyone working from home and doing video calls and so on. So I think broadly what we did was correct, led by my very good permanent secretary. We shifted resources from all the other different areas into the front line of dealing with the crisis. I think the risk is that if we put too many resources into communications, for most of normal activity, those will be surplus to requirements. So I think that is just, in terms of any recommendations the inquiry would choose to make, it's how one balances having too much idle or too many idle resources that aren't being used outside of a crisis situation.
Well, Sir Oliver, thank you. Those are my questions. I think there are, my lady, some questions from core participants.
There are. Ms Beattie, who sits just there.
Sir Oliver, I ask questions on behalf of national disabled people's organisations, being organisations that are majority-led, directed, staffed and governed by disabled people, as distinct from charities. The National Lottery Community Fund guidance that was used for the Coronavirus Community Support Fund suggested that priority should be given to organisations that are primarily led by people with lived experience. And said this applies throughout the whole organisation, including senior management and board representation, and also priority to organisations that are currently and historically underfunded, for example, disabled people's organisations. But that being so, that intention wasn't actually within the guidance carried through into the description of 3 priority organisations that would be earmarked for that funding. So my question is, did any reviews of that Coronavirus Community Support Fund assess and look at whether funds in fact went to representative organisations, being ones such as DPO, which are primarily led by people with that lived experience, as distinct from charities?
I'm afraid I can't give you that answer now, but I'm very happy to write back in terms of the reviews that were undertaken, in terms of the extent to which it manifested itself in terms of the resources that were given to those disabled-led organisations. It certainly, as you say, it was reflected in the criteria that was provided for it. And it was something we were mindful of as a government, and indeed we were governed by in all our decisions by the public sector equality duty to bear these things in mind.
And I think, do we also see it actually as part of the grant management and reporting requirements that was coming from the fund into the department about whether those organisations were in fact receiving, applying and being given those grants? Do you remember seeing that kind of analysis coming in?
I can't recall. That's not to say that I didn't see it. What I do recall, though, and indeed in the conversations that we had around the designing of the scheme, was first of all to make sure that the scheme addressed those concerns, and making sure, in terms of discharging our public sector equality duty, making sure that groups most in need had access to the schemes. And it was also the case, I think, that when we had, subsequently as the crisis went on, the Cabinet Office certainly looked at groups that required more support as well. So it was something that was front of mind throughout the period of time. What I can't refer you to now, and I'm happy to write back on, is the specifics of how that may have manifested itself in advice that I received.
And do you think that grant criteria could be better designed to ensure that it does get to such organisations?
I mean, I think I'm afraid without pulling it up in front of me, I can't say for certain, but I do seem to recall that one of the criteria specifically dealt with this. Of course, as I made the point in evidence previously, there's always ways that we can refine this, and if we had had more time to design it in more detail, I would have liked us to have engaged more with more organisations to make sure that we could ensure that guidance was absolutely bespoke to the needs of those sectors.
So in the event of a future pandemic, do you think that both disabled people's organisations and the National Council for Voluntary Organisations could be better involved in helping to determine and shape that kind of support package?
Yes, what I would rather is that they were, we talked about a war book sort of plans for COVID going forward, that we had that engagement before in terms of our general resilience planning. What I can't say is that if we were faced with the same situation again, we may well find the same problem of just the speed of engagement, which meant that we did engage with disability organisations, but it tended to be more through other representative organisations of different charities. We just didn't have the time to engage with every single organisation. It tended to be more representative organisations of different groups of charities. But I certainly think that is an important consideration.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. Mr Jacobs. Mr Jacobs is over that way. So.
Oh, sorry, right.
Sure, there's some questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress.
Yes.
As I know you were acutely aware, many in the creative industries found themselves out of work, but also, because of the nature of their employment, also ineligible for support, whether under the job retention scheme or the self-employed scheme. We understand from your statement that it was raised with the Treasury by your department. Why was it that ultimately there wasn't a deviation from the pan-economic approach, or pan-economy approach as you've described it, in order to address the problem with sector-specific support?
Well, I believe rather like the issue of volunteering, and we covered off, it was finding a way that we could do this that address the concerns of the sector. So I think some of the issues related, for example, to whether those people have been trading for long enough to be able to provide sufficient accounts to do so. There was also, I think, an issue separately. There was an issue around thresholds, where I believe there was a cut-off, I think, at £50,000. Ultimately, the Treasury took the view that in terms of protecting public funds, they didn't want to raise that threshold across the board. What I should say, though, is that I was very mindful of this, both in terms of the Cultural Recovery Fund, and that's one of the reasons why we came to quite a large sum for the Cultural Recovery Fund. I did try to encourage in the distribution of that, see how we could support the self-employed and the creatives, and why latterly I was very keen to get sectors to reopen to create opportunities. For example, we managed to do that with the Film and Television Restart Scheme.
Sir Oliver, you've helpfully pointed to some of the causes of those gaps that were felt particularly keenly in the creative industries. But that doesn't necessarily explain why there wasn't a sector-specific package for those working in the sector. Do I understand that it was really a practical problem?
So I think principally it was about when we engaged with the Treasury, we couldn't find a way of making that work from a practical perspective. But I would just like to pick up on the point that you made about the sector-specific scheme. There was the £1.57 billion Culture Recovery Fund. Now, of course, that was not directly aimed at creatives and the self-employed, but by getting resources to those organisations, it created opportunities for them. So there was some indirect support that way. But of course, it's a regret of mine that we couldn't find a way of doing that, and I was acutely aware of the pressures that those individuals were under.
And on this point, at paragraph 116 of your statement, you describe having raised this point with the Treasury. You say ultimately the collectively agreed approach was to take broad measures, and then you say in future resilience planning should develop a more detailed understanding within sectors of employment types so we have a clearer view at the outset. What would or should that more detailed understanding lead to in terms of perhaps the war book, to use your phrase?
Yes. So the trade-off that we were making was between a simplicity and bespoke schemes. I think that if we had more time and in designing it in future, with time, I would hope that we could find a way of designing the self-employed support scheme in such a way that it would capture more creatives than we managed to do. So that wasn't from a lack of will on the department side, nor I think from the Treasury side. It was just how we could tailor that scheme as it was at the time to meet those needs. With more time, I would hope that we could find something that met those needs.
And with more time, might it be that rather than perhaps seeing simplicity of a pan-economic scheme with a bespoke scheme, that actually a bespoke scheme could be supplementary? It could overlay a national scheme.
Well, I think the challenge with that is that one can end up in the situation where there's a myriad of bespoke schemes. So I did support the position that the Treasury took, which was to try and have a pan-economy scheme that did what it said on the tin, helped all sectors, because there's a benefit of that simplicity. So I would rather that the approach for doing it would be to design the pan-economy schemes in such a way as they captured more self-employed, rather than overlaying the pan-economy scheme with a myriad of bespoke schemes for different sectors.
But the outcome either way should be narrowing the gaps.
I would very much hope so, yes.
My lady, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. That completes the questions we have for you, Sir Oliver. Thank you very much indeed for your help and for coming back for a second time and preparing the witness statement. You've offered very kindly to produce more information to save you unnecessary work or your former colleagues unnecessary work. The inquiry will contact you if it needs more from you, if that suits you.
Great, thank you very much.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much again. Really grateful. Very well, I shall return at 25 to 2.